Western shows would oftentimes feature Indians, some of them in a bad light. So yes, I grew up reading about, thinking about the American Indians. Basically, they're talking about the persons whom the Europeans found over here when Europeans arrived in the 1500s. We sometimes abbreviate them as Americans to distinguish them from, let's say, Indians, or Indians from India. These are Indians from America. Now, according to standard theory, they came over here from Siberia. If you look on a world map, which there are some featured in your book, there's a small isthmus between Alaska and Siberia. And during the last ice age, this isthmus would have frozen over, and the American Indians then could have walked from Siberia to Alaska. That's the standard view. Now, if you ask any Indian where he came from, the ones of them who know, not one of them will tell you that they came from Siberia. They always said they came from across the sea. Now, it is now known that you can cross the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean in rowboats. It has been done. You can cross the ocean in 40 and 50 foot little, what you call skiffs or whatever. But they all said that they came across the sea. When Cortez met Montezuma, he said, yeah, we know where you came from across the sea. I've done some extensive research in this recently, and you oftentimes find place names among the American Indians that are similar to place names in the Old World, with a few variations. And also, all of the American Indian tribes had flood stories, stories about a Garden of Eden, stories about a fall from a paradise. They had zodiac with 12 signs, so in other words, indicating that these Indians did in fact at one time have some kind of, or they originated from the same place as humanity. Then of course DNA test shows that all humans are related anyway. So personally, I seriously doubt that any of them came across the Bering Strait, but nevertheless, that's what the standard anthropologists will tell you. So that's what I'll teach, at least for the moment, but with a lot of reservation. The Olmec, now, there is another tribe, Olmec, and I had a few years ago some African students who were quick to point out the Olmec Indians lived in what is today Mexico, and they had a lot of, they made faces, statues of faces that had a lot of African features. African style faces, and also they featured in their artwork tigers, animals that are not found in Central America, indicating strongly that the Olmecs may have come from Africa, which I strongly suspect. Anyway, first Indians, we'll start with the Olmec. The first civilization among the Indians was the Olmec. And again, it seemed to have thrived a little bit more than 1,000 years ago. Your book shows a map. There's the Olmec in the Gulf of Mexico, between Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. And then after them came the Zapotecs. I'm not going to write down the word Zapotec. But then, of course, to the north of the Zapotecs and Olmecs were the Aztec, and then south of them were the Maya. Now, these I do want you to remember. All of these civilizations had one thing in common. They lived in approximately the same region of southern Mexico, or what is today Mexico and Guatemala. And they rose, came about, lived for a while, and then died. Rose. Now, the reason we remember them is these were some of the biggest civilizations in the old world. ever, it is, I mean in the New World, but it's known that all these civilizations, and we call them civilizations because they had a civil society, but they practiced human sacrifice, among other things. And this was a characteristic of them. And they seem to have a knack for dying out and decaying. Now, the Aztec were especially interested because these were the people that Cortez met. When he came, Cortez was a white Spaniard, European. He met these people. And also later some other Spanish met the Maya, but the Maya were in an advanced state of decline. Now the Maya made a lot of news here in recent years. When I first taught at this school in the year 2000, and I asked the class a question, when does the Mayan calendar end? Nobody in the class knew. But now by 2006, half of them knew. By 2008, they all knew. The Mayan calendar, such as it was, came to an end on December 21st, 2012. Most of you might have forgotten that by now. But the Mayan calendar ended, and of course they asked the Mayans, well, what does this mean? And some Mayans eventually said, hey, we're tired of being asked. Well, what's going to happen when 2012 is over? They said, we just simply start a new calendar, just like you do on December 31st. The year ends December 31st, you start a new year. So suppose if the Maya had been, they had their old civilization, they started a new calendar. Now, again, the Olmec appears to me, at least, and to other people, I've had African students, and the Olmec appear to have come from Africa. We can't tell that for sure because we don't have any of their bodies. Now, the Maya. The Maya had writing, lots of them, and they wrote their history in 9 books. Now, on a personal note, I visited Central America in 1976. And when I went there in 1976, I visited the Great Big Pyramid of Copan, which is actually more massive than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Your book shows a picture of the Pyramid of Copan on page 162 and compares it to the Great Pyramid of Egypt. Now, these Maya were builders, but they had 9 books. The Spanish came over and found them. A Spanish priest deciphered the writings. And the Spanish, once they deciphered the writings, said, hey, this is the work of the devil. And they destroyed 5 of the 9 books, and they were permanently lost. However, the other 4 remained undestroyed. And a lot of Europeans said, hey, we ought to preserve this. Who knows what kind of knowledge they have. But for hundreds of years, nobody could read them. The last Mayans who knew how to read them died. The Spanish priest who learned how to read died. But we still had the 4 books. It was enough to where we, with the help of some of their inscriptions and their books, we were able to decipher them. Now, when I was there in 1976, I told myself when we decipher them, and I knew we eventually would, I'm going to make sure I read them. They deciphered them. And folk, I'm about to side with the Spanish. I don't want to read them. Some of the stuff they contain is material about how to communicate with the spirit world, particularly how to... Then the idea is to let out enough of your blood until you start hallucinating because of lack of blood. And then whatever visions you have, that's a message from the spirits. I mean, this is actually in the books, and I can somewhat understand why the Spanish would have destroyed 5 of the books. But on the other hand, they have a story about the Garden of Eden, with the story of Eve being deceived by the serpent, very similar to what's told in the Bible. And several years ago, I had a student recommend I get a book, which I got from eBay and read, that said the Mayans came from another planet. I don't believe it, but nevertheless, unfortunately, they fell to the habit of human sacrifice because they copied it from their Olmec and Aztec and Zapotec neighbors. But it's just but otherwise they were descended from other races, not human. Again, not but there have been all kinds of stories creep up about who the Maya were. The Maya civilization was already in an advanced state of decline by the time the Europeans found them, and we don't know why they declined. One theory is they overcut the rainforest. Now, the rainforest is a glorified word for jungle. And to farm, they would hack away with their machetes deep into the jungle until they cut away the rainforest, and the land that way became unproductive. They kept farming the same ground year after year without fertilizers. And other stories is that they have suffered from rebellions, wars, possibly, oh yeah, that also the climate change, the rain stopped falling. All of these stories might be partially true, but to Mayans' decline, unlike the Olmecs and Zapotecs, whom we don't have any, we don't know who their descendants were, the Maya are still around. They no longer speak their native tongue. They speak Spanish now, but they're still there. Now, the Aztec. These were the people that Cortez met. Essentially, the Aztec apparently originated in what is today New Mexico, came down and saw a decayed Zapotecan civilization and probably decayed Mayan, and they were a warlike people. They conquered the southern Mexicans, and using what is today Mexico City as their capital, they built a great empire that included almost all of what is today Mexico. Now, they had a tradition that one day one of their gods was going to return, and they believed that Cortez was the god who was destined to return. Now, folk, today's modern world of political correctness, nobody really has an answer to this. But here's the scenario that actually happened. Cortez was talking to Montezuma one day, and he heard a bunch of hideous screams from the temple. Now, among the Indians was a young woman who had a gift for learning languages very fast. I don't. I've tried to study and learn Spanish, and I have a difficult time picking it up. But this lady had the gift of learning languages. She learned Spanish really fast. She was a Mayan. I mean, she was an Aztec woman. And she was serving as an interpreter between Cortez and Montezuma. Anyway, when Cortez asked her what's the meaning of the sacrifices, he was told, oh, these are people that we're sacrificing to the sun god to feed the sun god, to appease the wrath of the sun god. Well, Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods, but devils. This created a few tense moments between Cortez and Montezuma, but peacekeepers on both sides moved in and kind of smoothed things over. I'm about to tell you what Cortez did about the situation, but my question to you is, and I always ask this, folks, if you had been there with Cortez and heard the screams and learned that these people were being offered a sacrifice, these were fellow humans like yourself being offered a sacrifice, what would you have done?
Was it like slaves who were?
That, to me, beside the point. Actually, the sacrifices were persons that they would go around and collect and bring in, not criminals. I mean, that would have been a little bit different. Not even necessarily slaves, but common people, mostly common people.
Did anybody like offer themselves up for sacrifice? Was it
okay, was it voluntary? Most of the time it was not. There might have been a few cases, but for the most part it was, these people did not willingly volunteer. They were pulled in.
And they just like, didn't they just like cut their heart out?
Cut their heart out, yes. And the idea, though, was to do it so that the whole idea was the more gruesome and more painful and more excruciating and horrible it was, the more pleasing it was to the sun god. So it was not a quick death. It was a very excruciating, slow, painful death. And that's why the screams could be heard hundreds of feet away. Anybody have any idea? Now, of course, you may know already what Cortez did. He got together an army of mostly Indians. I mean, Cortez only had 200 white men with him. But when Cortez landed, he told his men, all right, folk, it did, says Julius Caesar, turn around and bury the ship. I mean, but not bury, burn the ships. We're not going back. We're either going to conquer this land or we're going to die. And he had armor and he had guns, but even with the armor and guns, his 200 men could not have conquered Montezuma's army of 100,000 men. But what he did was he rounded up an army that consisted of tens of thousands of Indians And these Indians went and fought and overthrew Cortez. Now, there are 4 reasons given in your book, or one time were given why Cortez won. Reason number 1, was that without meaning to, Cortez used germ warfare. In other words, Europeans had diseases, particularly smallpox and typhus, that the Indians had never been exposed to and had no immunity to whatever. Smallpox and typhus carried away about 90% of the Indian population, a very high percentage, but they used germ warfare without meaning to. Reason number 2, half of Montezuma's army refused to fight. They said, these people are gods, so we can't win. So half of Montezuma's army refused to fight. Reason number 3 was the fear factor. The ones who fought were just terrified beyond belief. I mean, hey, we're fighting against gods, and we have no chance. Then reason number 4, of course, Cortez had guns and armor and cannon that even made it. The Indians looked on an armored man on horseback as being a man with 2 heads. The horse was one head, the man was the other. They looked at him as being one person. Apparently they never saw a man dismount from a horse. The Indians had no horses. But between all this, Cortez dethroned Montezuma, stopped the sacrifices. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, folk, is there were 400 years of wars between European and Indian, in which the Indians lost. And a lot of folk will talk about how horrible Americans are. I mean, I've got a movie that's in my computer and I'm watching it. It's the movie entitled America that some of you may have seen. Came out about a year or so ago. Talk about how horrible the United States is, how awful Europeans are. My take on it is that the Indians brought it on themselves. In other words, they had done themselves in. And if, all right, I'm going to get to North America in a little bit, but I'm going to talk now about Mexico and Central America. If the Europeans had not come in, the Indians might very well have become extinct. They were killing each other off worse. I mean, I had one people talk, these peaceful Indians. The study of their bodies, their grades, shows that they were as addicted to warfare as anybody else. Many of them, most of them, met their death violently, particularly the men, indicating they were killed in war. They were as addicted to warfare as anybody else. Not that that's so bad, but they were not. They were anything but peaceful. Modern day political correctness simply cannot answer what should Cortez have done. Cortez simply felt like he could not allow this to go on. He felt like this was demonic. I'm not saying Cortez was the best example of Christianity that there was, but Cortez at least was a Christian, and at least he was a member of the church and been baptized. But he simply could not allow this to go on. He went in and put a stop to it, and the sacrifices have been stopped to this day. Now, there is a movement that says, who are we to say that we're better than they are? Well, who are we to say that our way is better? I'll let each of you decide that for yourself. But the point I want to make is I think the Indians invited the treatment they received. Now, moving from there to, by the way, I must also go on to say that Cortez went on to enslave all the Indians, including the ones who had helped him overthrow Montezuma. Now, how did he get half the army of some 50 or 60,000 to fight for him? The fact is, Montezuma's tax collectors were going around taking anything they wanted, including their women. They'd take wives and daughters to use as sex slaves. Needless to say, Cortez had little trouble convincing them that, hey, you know, I can set you free from this. I can free you from this evil ruler you have over you. So, again, Montezuma brought his problems on himself.
What year?
1521. I'm glad you asked.
They had guns.
Huh?
They had guns with them.
They had what?
You said that he had guns.
Had
Guns, like shooting guns.
Oh yeah, he had guns. Yeah, they had guns. The Europeans, the gunpowder was invented by the Chinese and then spread into Europe. But in the 100 Years' War, which we'll talk about at the end of the, they were using gunpowder and guns in the year 1400. Joan of Arc ran into them in the year 1431. But they had guns. By 1521, they had lots of guns. But the Europeans were still wearing armor. But the Europeans had cannon and guns, yeah, even as long ago as 1521. All right, now North America. The Indians living around here in Georgia were mostly Creek, Cherokee. Don't worry about those names so much, but a few points I want to make. When Europeans found them, the Indians in North America were few and far between. They were widely scattered. But we also found a lot of mounds. The mounds were apparently used as burial sites, but the mounds had been built apparently by Indians who were, I mean, at first when we saw the mounds, we said, hey, these primitive Indians could not have built them. But then we realized the Indians who had lived before the Europeans found them were more advanced than the ones that the Europeans would have found later. You know, basically the American Indian society was in a state of decline. If the Europeans had visited in the year 1000, or even back up a little bit, even in the year 0, about the time of Christ, they would have found in North America a whole lot of cities, some cities with 50 or 60,000 people. They'd have found trade, there was communication. I mean, we find Wisconsin artifacts or things that were produced down in Florida, and vice versa, Florida artifacts up in Wisconsin, indicating that there was a lot of trade going on, a lot of commerce. Then the Indians declined. In other words, they were not rising up to a higher level. They were declining from a more advanced civilization until by the time the Europeans found them in the 1500s, the Indians living in what is today the United States and Canada and Alaska were no longer what we call civilized. They become a tribal people. Now, what happened to them along the way? Now, my personal take on it, as I've studied, is the American Indians became communist. Now, we think of communism as being something evil, and perhaps it is. They were not the Marxist-Leninist kind of communist, but they were communist in that they lived in communes. They called them villages. They had no social classes, no money, no private ownership of property. This is one of the reasons they clashed with Europeans, because Europeans want to set up borders and fences and say, hey, this is my side over here, and that's your side over there. Europeans, I mean, Indians did not understand private property. But they believed that all of the land belonged to everybody, and everything belonged to everybody. So, again, there was no private ownership. They became true out-and-out communists, with the result that their cultural level went down and down and down and down until by the time the Europeans found their cultural level was near almost 0. Their population declined with their culture. Yes?
I was going to say, do you think it's better to have no social class? Or
I definitely think. I mean, all right, I'm not going to stand here and say that I think that any way of living you choose is okay, that one way is as good as another, and who's to say that one... We tried 20 years ago, our college were pushing multiculturalism. And yeah, I believe in studying other cultures, but to think that we ought to copy, I mean, some of these cultures have practices that folk I don't even want, can't even name here in a class of mixed company. To answer your question, I think that communism is always wrong wherever it's practiced, even if it's not the Marxist-Leninist. I mean, Marx and Lenin taught that there was no God. Well, the American Indians, I mean, they were very religious people. They believed definitely in spirits and that there was a great spirit. They believed in various gods. But nevertheless, socialism or communism, is a little bit of both, transformed their cultural level to near 0. Their population declined. And again, if the white man had not come on the scene, perhaps they would have all become extinct anyway. Now, what you have, if you could visit the world in the year 1492, at the beginning of 1492, you have the big Atlantic Ocean. On one side are about 80 million Europeans. In Mexico, there's about 80 million Indians living. And in North America, we don't know what the population, we can only guess, but maybe about 2 or 3 million American Indians living in what is today the United States and Canada. Inevitably, these cultures were to meet. Had there been an Indian tribe that had come over to Europe first and met the Europeans, the results would have been the same. When you have two unequal cultures meet, the one culture is almost inevitably going to be absorbed. Now, when the Europeans discovered the Indians, Europeans eventually began to move in and take over and drive the Indians out. And if you had been around then, if you had not come over yourself, your cousins would have. There were attempts to make peace, but folk, almost every attempt to make peace with people like that, I mean, for two unequal people with different values, came up short. William Penn tried hard to make peace with the Delaware Indians, otherwise known as the Lenape Indians, but the peace did not last. Eventually, the people of Pennsylvania had to drive them out because the Lenape Indians said, hey, you killed our children, so we're going to come in and we're going to steal your children. And the Europeans then had to get their armies together and drive them all the way to Illinois and Indiana, and kept driving them farther west. Again, folk, my ancestors, some of them were Indian fighters. But my ancestors had three choices. Choice number one is they could have gone back to Europe, and they chose not to. Choice number two, they could have simply rolled over and died, and they chose not to do that. Choice number three, they could have fought. They fought, and they won. Unfortunately, that's bad news for the Indians. Again, if you're telling Europeans they should have stayed there when there was vast, vast acres of productive farmland over here, and not to mention the thought of gold and silver, which there was some over here. If you told the Europeans to stay home, it was futility. It couldn't have been done. There was no one emperor in Europe who could say, all of us stay here. Europe was divided, and there was no one big chief among the Indians. The Indians were even more divided than the Europeans. The result was, inevitably, the Indian culture got swallowed up. Now, some people said, oh, well, it's because the Indians didn't have guns. That's true, but then again, by the time of 1680, King Philip's War, the Indians did have the guns and knew how to use them. But the other problem is the Indians were hopelessly outnumbered. Indian women, pretend, this is true in socialistic societies, both communistic societies. Women in communism tend to have no more than about 1 or 2 babies per woman. And keep in mind the average age of Indian at death, and we know this from studying their bodies, their bones were dug up. The average age of the Indian at death was about 18. They lived an average of 18 years. Rarely did an Indian live to be 40. Their population was going downhill really fast. Now, we know, of course, Columbus is credited to being the first person to discover them, but we also know that long, 500 years before Columbus, the Vikings came over. Vikings. They came around the year 1000. Oops, what's wrong with me? We also now know that numerous fishermen came across the Atlantic, and in those days they didn't have radio and television to talk about it, but they would leave their shores from some small obscure village and cross the Atlantic, and they would fish off the coast of Indian waters. Some of them set foot on American soil, and they may have spread their diseases among the Indians, particularly typhus and smallpox. The Indian population was just simply going downhill fast. Number one, they wouldn't have a lot of babies. And number two, they had short lives. And they fought among themselves, they warred among themselves, and they had diseases that were given to them by the Europeans until their population was decimated to the point where they had vast, vast acres of land over here in North America that Europeans found too tempting to resist. All right. Now, moving on. Before I do, let me double check. Christian. Okay. Brian Cardenas. All right. Victor Gong. Victor. Sammy. Oh, yeah. All right. Jonathan Joseph. Habib. Habib. Okay. Kyungrak. Here. Oh, yeah. Matthew Lawrence. Lemuel McCullough. There we go. Richard O'Driscoll. Laura Ocampo. Vanessa Perez. Ashley Smith.
actually.
All right, then the rest of you counted present. Okay. Oh yes. Point I want to make, not far from here, there are Indian mounds in Georgia. And the nearest ones I know of are the New Echota Mounds. And I went there in 1978, and my wife and I went back as recently as last summer. And I took some videos and pictures. But the mounds are impressive if any of you want to go. And they have a lot of Indian artifacts. The original mounds were probably built around the year 800. But again, apparently they had a much larger population in the year 800, 900, 1000, up to 1300. They had a much larger population they had when the Europeans first came in the 1500s. Now, the story of how De Soto and Ponce de Leon went through Florida, and De Soto came through Georgia, and Coronado went through the western part. All this is for American history. But the explorers went through. But anyway, there are mounds throughout Ohio also, including a mound that we didn't realize what it was until we flew over an airplane. This mound is a 10-mile-long twisting rattlesnake. Winding, you might say, rattlesnake. We've had the head on one end, the rattles on the other, 10 miles, and folk to build something like that called for some advanced geometry, unless they'd have built it directly from the airway. Yes?
When you say mound, do you mean a village?
No, a mound is a hill. You know, they're put together like you visit the Etowah Indian mounds. They're hills that are artificial. You can tell they're artificial because they have almost straight up sides and right angles at the corners. You know, it's something that does not occur in nature, and very flat tops.
So what is it actually for?
Burial, mostly. Burial, or the other thing they might have been for was for defense. In other words, for the way they fought, it was advantageous to be on top. So if you were on a higher elevation, your enemy was down in the valley below, you had a better chance of winning because it was easier to throw a rock downhill or shoot an arrow downhill than it was to shoot an arrow up, and the arrow would strike with more force if it was going down. So it was just simply the person on the top had a big advantage. Now, something else, now that I'm on the subject of fighting, about the American Indians' way of fighting that was disastrous. During World War I, John Joseph Pershing, who had been an Indian fighter, would not take Indians into his army. But he finally did as signal soldiers because they knew languages that the Germans didn't know. Pershing learned Navajo, and a bunch of his officers knew Navajo, so they could talk to each other on their telephones and on their radios in Navajo. Pershing was the World War I general in charge of all the American forces in World War I.
Isn't it called wind talk? Windbreaker or codebreaker?
But the Germans could listen in on two Indians talking to each other, and none of them knew the language. Not one German knew Navajo in World War I, and not one German, in fact, knew any of the Indian languages. So they could talk. He took them in, but the problem was you never think of American Indians as being soldiers. They were fighters. They didn't have. I mean, they lacked the ability to organize. They did not lack courage. They had plenty of courage. They were fighters. They're sometimes called braves, like the Atlanta Braves. They might be called warriors, but what's the difference, folks, between a brave and a soldier? Any one of you know? There's a big difference.
The soldier gets the orders.
The soldier gets the orders. That's very close. That's very good. A soldier fights as a team. When the Indians went to battle, they'd look around and, who's my size? Okay, you're my size. And they'd pick on him, and the two of them would fight it out. And once one of them had finished the other one off, the victor would look around and see who else he could find to fight. Soldiers line up in this line, and you don't fight them individually. You have to fight the whole bunch of them. You start fighting one, you fight them all. Soldiers fight from formations, as a unit, as a team. Genghis Khan, when we talk about later, organized army into squads of 10 and said everybody in this squad must always be in the squad. Anyone who leaves the squad of 10 will be put to death. Stay with your squad. The squad always fought as a unit, and nobody could fight with one of them individually. The American Indians lacked the organization. One of the other problems they had. All right. Now, Moving on to South America, we now know, this was something we did not know even when I was a kid, that there were a lot of civilizations that started in South America. And your book names them, I'm not going to write them down, but among them the Corral and the Mochi. And these made for a lot of, well, they made for some advanced civilizations. But the one group I will ask you to learn is the Incas. And this is the group that the white man met. They lived in what is today Peru. And in fact, their descendants are still there. Yes?
Weren't the Incas or the Aztecs that like some disappeared?
In the case of the Aztecs, I believe they've pretty well disappeared. But the Incas, these people are still there, like the Maya. People are there, they still call themselves Maya, and they probably are descended from the Maya. Same with the Incas. They have not completely disappeared from history. Now, one group that has, the Arawak. The Arawak as a tribe have disappeared, but then when they started doing DNA research, we found out that 60% of the people living in the Indians living in the Caribbean have Arawak DNA in them. So there's the Arawak DNA is still around. All right, what you have, folk, with these peoples, they may have disappeared as a name, like the Sumerians. As a civilization, they disappeared, they were forgotten about for 2,000 years. But the Jewish people are their descendants, among others. Yes?
It'll be a little bit like ahead.
Like who?
Ahead, like far off. But what do you think about the Roanoke?
Roanoke?
The disappearance?
There's been a lot, hey, I've read a lot about that. It's not far off. I basically think that they came in, they ran into famine, the white man, and they were overrun by the Indians and captured and scattered among the Indian tribes, is what I suspect. And by the time the Europeans came back, if they'd have had helicopters and airplanes, they might could have found their lost relatives, but they didn't have any of those, so they simply were dependent on sheer luck. But they did find a white girl living among the Indians one time, this story is told. They probably were taken by the Indians and enslaved, and then all died out eventually, because Europeans simply could not survive Indian diseases no more than Indians could survive European diseases. Hey, folk, it was just yesterday. I mean, this may be also that I met in a group with, I work at a group at the church I attend. I don't say much about religion here, but the church and I work with this group. And the director was talking about how his son went to Central America went to Belize, in fact, to just do away with civilization, do away with money, and live and farm. Well, a bunch of bugs from Central America came out and started grabbing him and his wife, and just, I don't know, but they're bugs bigger than houseflies, about the size of our big butterflies. And he had no resistance, no immunity. And he was so miserable he had to give up the farm and just quit until his wife moved back to the United States. So now he's going to take up the same life somewhere in Europe. I used to wonder myself, wouldn't it be great to just go back in time and live like a caveman and not have, but they had their miseries too. And folk, I can't stand mosquitoes, but we have them here. But we have killer bees that might come, fire ants. The fire ant is not native to America. We managed to import that from somewhere. But these problems. But all right, back to South America. Now, there are mysterious structures in South America, among them the Nazca Lines. And even your authors will tell you that there is a group of people who say that they were built by space aliens. I'm not going to go that far. Others say that whoever built them had to have directed the operation from outer space, because simply people on the ground could not have made lines that straight for that long without modern technology, without laser beams. These lines are very long and very straight, very parallel, and a person on the ground cannot see, like a person on one standing on one line cannot see on the other. So there's no way they could have made them parallel without some kind of equipment. It's just one of the mysteries of ancient man. How did he construct these things? How did he build them? My take on it is that man was once far, far more advanced than we give him credit for. And yeah.
That's what I always thought, like, something dies out and we lose that contact,
Right.
who knows if we'll ever figure that information. Like if what's his name, Ford never invented the car and no one knew about the car, what do you think someone else might
Someone
have
else
invented?
would have in today's
Do you think
world.
so?
In today's world, yes.
See, that's what I'm thinking. Maybe there was so much
In the
more
case
about
of
that.
telephone, 70 men invented the telephone when the technology was right. 70 men invented all at once, but the courts upheld Alexander Graham Bell because he had a paper that proved that he had done it a few hours before the next man had.
Really?
Yeah, but actually 70, and when the automobile, folks, we don't know, Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. He copied it. The automobile, nobody knows who invented it. It's just all of a sudden, a bunch of them appeared out of people's garages and people's sheds. And no, we don't know who built the first one. The airplane, that's different. We can document who built that. But if the Wright brothers hadn't done it, it was inevitable. Someone would have. That's my take. Now, again, the next chapter is going to be on Islam, folk. And I'm going to say, if the Wright brothers had lived in an Islamic country, I doubt that they would have been in anything. And I mean, I'm not aware of some of it might be Islamic, but people who invent are free people. So if Henry Ford had not made the Ford, somebody else would have. If the Wright brothers had made the airplane, somebody else would have. To answer that is what I think. But if the United States had not been the United States and Europe had not been free, we would still be riding horses to work today, or to school today. And the schools like this would be lighting our classroom with candles. Progress is not inevitable. If anything is inevitable, folks, it's decline. And most of human history is a story of decline. People who have advanced form, and we'll talk about this again when we come to Africa, people who once were highly advanced and who lost their technology and lost ability and decline. Now, I mentioned also, in addition to the Nazca lines, there's Cuzco. I won't write this down, but Cuzco is in Peru. It's a place where you have the ocean right here, and rising straight up from the ocean is a 13,000-foot high cliff, so high you cannot breathe without breathing apparatus. I mean, you can get used to it. I mean, you can gradually rise to that high. But if you're sitting on sea level and you go to sea level 13,000 feet, you'll die. But if you take it several days at a time and gradually increase, humans can survive at 13,000 feet. These stones that were used to build the buildings at Cuzco were quarried at sea level and raised up 13,000 feet, apparently without a roadway. And folk, we have no idea how it was done. Of the stones that were used to build the city of Cuzco, no two of them were alike. And yet every one of them fits to the one next to it like pieces of an interlocking puzzle. Have any of you heard of this from other sources by any chance? You can look it up. Cuzco is in Peru. Of course, to me, there's no rational explanation except the persons who built it had more technology on the ball than we do. Our modern day helicopters and airplanes could never lift those stones that far, that high. Balloons, not unless it was a huge balloon. Now, speaking of balloons, we do know that the South American Indians had the balloon. They had balloons that were capable of carrying man, and you might think, well, didn't this teach them to fly? You'll never guess hardly what they used them for. No, they didn't use them to fly. They would use the balloons to take a body and bury them, and the balloon would raise the body and carry it over the Pacific, and eventually they knew the balloon would give out and drop the body in the Pacific. That was all they could think of to use a balloon for. I mean, in the Western world, the balloon led to the invention of the airplane. The balloons were used to spy during the Civil War, to spy on the Confederacy. But the idea of using balloons for navigational purposes, for flying purposes, never occurred to them. Just put dead bodies, and wind would carry the balloons high up, and then a western wind would pick them up, carry the bodies over the Pacific Ocean, and drop them. All right. Now the Inca. The Inca lived high in the Andes Mountains, and eventually an Inca emperor built up a large empire that was conquered by a European named Pizarro. when Pizarro, well, Pizarro was on the crew with Balboa, who first sighted the Pacific Ocean. Balboa was killed. So Pizarro took command, and Pizarro heard that just on the other side of the Pacific to the south lay a great rich colony. So the Spanish went there, went through the Isthmus of Panama, and they set up a settlement, a little colony there in the Inca territory. And at first they got along, but eventually more and more Europeans arrived until Pizarro felt like he could conquer them. So Pizarro went in and conquered the Incas. Now, he promised the Inca chieftain, that he would release the Inca. The Inca chieftain promised Pizarro that he could fill a room up with gold as high as this Inca could, halfway full of gold. The room was about the size of a classroom. Now, this is a bigger than normal classroom, but let's say the room was about the size of from here to the wall. The chieftain was a fairly tall man, probably about 6 feet tall, and he said, as high as I can reach, half full of gold. The Spanish never dreamed there was so much gold anywhere. But anyway, the chieftain filled the room with that much gold. Then Pizarro betrayed the chieftain and killed him, or the emperor and killed him. Pizarro was later paid for his treachery. He was killed by one of his own men. Now, the point I want to make is, where did this much gold come from? And folk, we have no way of knowing the answer. We don't know. But we do know where it went. The gold that had left Europe during the days of the Roman Empire never got back to Europe. But the Spanish carried a whole lot of gold they stole from the Indians back to Europe. And all of a sudden Europe became a gold-based economy again. The gold found its way into Spain. And from Spain it spread all over Europe thanks to the Spanish people buying a lot of other European products. It contributed to the downfall of Spain. Yes, you heard me say downfall, because Spain had so much gold that prices became inflated. It's called inflation. And the gold became worth less and less as they got more of it. But then the gold spread all over Europe, and Spain wound up losing it all. But Spain went from being one of Europe's richest countries to one of Europe's poorest. Again, where did all this gold come from? Oh, we have no way of knowing. We don't know. And a lot of persons who criticize Europeans will say that Europeans got their wealth by stealing it from the Indians. And folks, there's a ring of truth in that. But it still begs the question, how come it was not the Indians who came to Europe and conquered the Europeans instead of the other way around? Again, there was a certain quirk in the cultures of the two peoples, that the one was simply more advanced than the other. And the more advanced one wound up subjugating the other one. And I'm not saying this is the way it should be, but folks, the reality of it is that is simply the way life is. And try as we might, we cannot change it. Now, when your book talks about tribal peoples, they use the term stateless rather than use the term uncivilized, which has a negative connotation. So they talk about the stateless peoples, and your book shows the map on page 179 about the tribal peoples in North America, which we talked about a little bit. But now another people I want to mention is the Arawak. The first Indians that the Europeans encountered were the Arawak. These people apparently came out of South America and settled in the West Indies. And yes, they then had to have had boats. They had small canoes, which they used to hop from one of these West Indies islands to another. And they settled on the islands of Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, the island of Hispaniola, and the Bahama Islands. And they filled up these islands. And again, why didn't some of them build a bigger boat and wind up going to Europe? Apparently the idea never occurred to any of them. But the Arawak peoples became extinct. We believe that the Arawak did have some contact with the Indians of Central America, the Aztec and the Maya, and they practiced human sacrifice. Something that's interesting, I think, your book says on page 180, the men and women were considered equal. And folk, the Arawak are extinct. I mean, you know, I hate to harp on that. I mean, I know in my day, I mean, a lot of the young women were completely in the state of rebellion, you know, about women's liberation, the women's movement. But to check their history books. But the women were considered equal, and again, now when I say the Arawak are extinct, like I said a few minutes ago, some 60% of the Indian people living in what is today the East Indies Islands. In that region, 60% of them carry Arawak DNA. But as a nation, as an ethnic group, the Arawak are extinct. Now, when the Europeans encountered them, they appeared to be peaceful folk. All right, folk. Here's what one of my students wrote in a paper one time. Columbus met the Indians. That's step one. Then down here, step 3. She didn't write it this way. Columbus committed mass murder. Columbus is looked on by some as being the greatest mass murderer of all time. You notice I skipped 1 to 3. What they leave out is step 2. In step 2, Christopher Columbus's main ship, the Santa Maria, was shipwrecked when he had an 11-year-old. All right, Columbus had on his crew, folk, all he could get was a bunch of jailbirds, convicts, whom the Queen promised to free them if they took part on his journey. So he did not have the best of humanity. And one of the boys he carried on was an 11-year-old who he put in charge of the helm at the Santa Maria. And this boy dashed the Santa Maria against the stones, dashed to pieces. So Columbus had to leave a lot of his people behind, half his crew. When he came back, he found that all the white people who left behind were slaughtered. This girl left out. Now, what this did, this set the stage for 400 years of conflict, folks. It appears like the Indians may have drawn the first blood. Now, again, we don't know. Like I say, the people that Columbus left behind were convicts with some of the worst people, scum of Europe that Europe had to offer anyway. It might be that they provoked the Indians, or they were starving and decided to go out and steal, or whatever. They might have tried raping the Indian women. But the fact is, we don't know what went on. But when Columbus came back, he and his crew, this time he had 17 ships with him, they found all the white people dead. And they went on a killing rampage. Between disease and outright murder and enslavement and starvation, the Arawak population became extinct. Europeans, with the help of disease, and not just all murder, but with the help of disease, wound up killing some 90% of the Indian population who were living in Mexico and the West Indies. Again, you know, I've already given my take on it. There's a little bit going on both sides there, folks. All right. Your book talks about Amazonia, and I want to say this about Amazonia. This will not be on a test. From time to time, you'll hear stories that living in Brazil, in certain deep, deep jungles, there's about 100 tribes of 100 people who have no contact with the outside world, that technically are Brazilian citizens, but the Brazilian government does not count them on their census because they don't know they exist. But we're afraid to send anybody in to look after them, afraid that they'll get our diseases and they'll all be killed, that they would have no resistance. So we kind of keep a distance from them, and of course they keep a distance from us. But occasionally we might catch a glimpse of one of them and he'll turn and run off from us. But supposedly there are still some of these primitive people descended from the Indians that we found living then, living in small tribes who are unknown to the outside world. from time to time, they'll make news. All right. Leaving that, again, the sad story about the Indians sum up with their way of life perished. They were overran by people from another continent, and their spirit was broken. And today, a lot of them lead lives that are dejected and broken. They were the losers in this fight, long fight with the white man. Their way of life then was scorned and belittled. And again, it's a sad tale, sad story that might have had a different ending if they would have developed a different kind of culture. Again, I think the problem, to sum up, the problem with the ones that are living in North America, in one word, was communism. They gathered in small tribes. Karl Marx said if you developed a classless society, a utopia would result, a heaven on earth would result. What happens instead is culture becomes zero, and the American Indians were anything but peaceful. They spent a lot of time fighting among themselves. Wars broke out, the population declined, and their cultural level kept on declining with it. They went from being big city builders and city dwellers to teepee builders and teepee dwellers, wigwams. The wigwam looks like a loaf of bread almost. Teepee, cone-shaped. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. But they went from city dwellers to roving tribes people. When they'd used up all the resource they could at one land, they simply pack up and move to another land. They had no large animals except for the ones in South America had the llama. The Indians had no horse, no donkey, no pigs, no sheep, no cattle, no oxen. They had no oats, no wheat, no barley, no rye. They did give the New World maize or corn. Unfortunately, corn is one of the least nutritious foods you can have. But they did give the world corn. They also gave the New World the gourd, the squash, the turkey, the pumpkin, things like that. But they basically, they did not have the wheel. Oh yes, did not have the wheel, very important. They fell behind, being cut off from the rest of humanity, were the result that when they met the rest of the world, they simply were not up to competing with the rest of the world. And they didn't know it found out until too late. All right, anybody have any questions, comments? Right here in this room back in 2003, we had a big discussion on whether or not what the white man did was right. And one people capitalist said it was the best college discussion he'd ever had. But again, if you think...
Is killing right?
Well, here's the thing, with all respect, some people, if you don't kill them, they're going to come after you. And we're facing the same thing. Yeah. And we've been talking about this in the next chapter. We're about to find out, folks, in view of what's happening right here in March 15, 2011, why our ancestors felt like they had to go to war. Sometimes, as Abe Lincoln says, it's forced upon you. You go after them, or they're going to come and take everything you have.
You know what I don't get? Why are other countries mad at the United States? They can have the same stuff that we have, and just choose not to. Like, why? This is 2015. Like, everyone's the same. Like, why are we still fighting wars? Why is there still religious wars? Like, why can't everyone just be the same and live a happy life? Like, I mean, I know why because people are insane, but
the world always produces people like Hitler's, Stalin's, Mussolini's, and Karl Marx's, and persons like that. And folk, there's been no way to find a solution. Mankind has struggled all of our existence to find a cure for warfare, and
just get along.
It can't be done. But the other people come and fight you. If you don't go after them, they'll come after you.
That's true.
Very true. Yeah.